Today, there are almost 2.8 million Muslims in the UK, and recent stats seem to show a rise in the reversions to Islam in the UK in recent times. Faith Matters has estimated that there have been around 60,000 reversions to Islam in 2001 and up to 100,000 in 2011. With the fall in religious practice generally in the West, this rise of Islam has been viewed as alarming for some and deeply fascinating by others. It is no doubt a challenge for Muslims and non-Muslims alike. But what has been the reaction to Islam by the British in recent times? Has it been always so disfavourable? And if so, why? And what about the Muslims? What have been their reactions to the West? As part of our wider school project relating to UK Muslim heritage, we will be discovering what it means to be a Muslim citizen. This series will try and trace the different narratives used by Muslims and Westerners, focusing on the past, present and future. This will help us better understand each other and in turn help us to understand ourselves.
يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا لتعارفوا.
This episode will look at Muslims in Britain. The past. When we want to find out about Muslims in the West, where should we begin? Would you believe that we have to actually go back, right back, and begin when the ancestors of the English, the Anglo-Saxons and the Jews, first arrived on the shores of this island? Northern Germanic tribes, which included the Angles, Saxon and Jutes, began to raid and settle Britannia from about 300 CE. Between the period 500 CE and 1066, the indigenous pre-Christian belief system of the Anglo-Saxons was a form of Germanic paganism closely related to the Old Norse religion. The Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons began in 597 CE, when Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Christianity gradually replaced the indigenous religion of the English. In 601 CE, Augustine baptized the first Christian Anglo-Saxon king, Ethelbert of Kent. The last pagan Anglo-Saxon king, Arwald, died in 686 CE. Many miles away in Arabia, in 610 CE, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was given his first revelation, Al-Alaq, not far from Mecca in the cave of Hira. By 629 CE, the Prophet had ordered a written invitation to Islam be sent to the Christian Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, urging him to consider the truth of the Islamic deen. The Prophet's authentic teachings, however, would take centuries before it actually reached the shores of England. We wonder if even now it is entirely understood. Is there something in the course of these two histories that might lend themselves to misunderstanding? In her book, The Anglo-Saxon Perceptions of the Islamic World, Catherine Scarf Beckett provides the accounts of how the Saxons knew very little about the Muslims and relied heavily upon pre-Islamic Roman literature on the Arabs, who were known as the Saracenoi or Saracens. This relied especially heavily on the ideas of Saint Jerome, who died in 420 CE. To the Muslims, references to Britain are found in early Islamic geographical literature, such as the work in 800 CE of Ahmed ibn Rusta, who died in 910, which describes the islands of Britannia. For the more worldly minded, the Muslims were at the height of discovery and power at this time, with the celebrated dynasties of the Umayyads and the Abbasids. The points of contact between Europe and Islamic lands were multiple during the Middle Ages. The main points of transmission of Islamic knowledge to Europe were in Sicily and in Spain. In Sicily, following the Muslim conquest of the island in 965 CE,
and then its conquest by the Normans in 1091 CE, an intense Arab-Norman culture developed. The significance of the Normans is not irrelevant to English history, because in 1066 CE they had invaded England too, and after defeating the last Anglo-Saxon king, Harold, William the Conqueror took over. This is important as the Normans spoke medieval French, and the experience of Muslim culture in this period had an impact on Middle English culture too.
The Muslim contributions to medieval Europe were numerous, affecting such varied areas as art, architecture, medicine, agriculture, music, language, philosophy, science, and technology.
Muslim scholarship, especially early Islamic philosophy and Islamic science, became well known through Latin translation among the learned in England by 1386 CE, when Geoffrey Chaucer was writing. In the Canterbury Tales, there is a character who was a doctor of physic, whose learning included Rhazes, Avicenna, and Averroes. Roger Bacon, one of the earliest European advocates of the scientific method, is known to have studied the works of several early Muslim philosophers.
The first time Westerners experienced the works of the Muslims, it was an experience marked by love or hate. Some acknowledged the contributions, while many others downplayed it, often emphasizing how Europeans bettered the Muslim contributions, and many others completely ignored this process and negated that such an event took place. Sometimes Muslims fall victim to the reverse when they talk about their role to the West in arrogance. Muslims ought to be measured in the way they discuss this topic with Westerners. Remember, we must be balanced without compromise.
The medieval period was also the time of the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of expeditionary wars, blessed by the Pope and the Catholic Church, with the stated goal of restoring Christian access to the holy places in and near Jerusalem. The Crusades were originally launched in response to a call from the leaders of the Byzantine Empire, the Muslim Seljuk Turks, that cut off Christian access to Jerusalem. There seems to be two conflicting perspectives about this by Western writers. The first, summarized by Jonathan Riley Smith in his book The First Crusaders, explains that the Crusades were also sparked by the destruction of many Christian sacred sites and the persecution of Christians under the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. Michael D. Hull wrote an article in Military History magazine, said something slightly different but equally significant. The Pope was responding in part to rumors, mostly false, of Muslim atrocities committed against Christian pilgrims visiting the Holy Land, and he sought a means of uniting Europe's contentious kings and lords in a common cause.
Which perspective is more right? Sometimes we can never know, but Allah does. Sometimes it's a bit of both. The lesson? To the Europeans, often there are mistruths about the deeds of Muslims spread by those in positions of power and responsibility and who should know better. Often, such sentiment results in war and the tragic loss of life. To the Muslims, that the misactions of Muslims affect non-Muslims, and they have consequences too. Muslims must be mindful of this, especially those in positions of power.
From this period till the 1300s CE, numerous European students attended Muslim centers of higher learning, Jamiat, which is plural of Jamia, university. A notable English example of such a scholar is Adelard of Bath. Adelard of Bath, who died in 1152 CE, was an English natural philosopher. He is known for both his original works and for translating many important Greek and Arab scientific works of astrology, astronomy, philosophy, and mathematics into Latin from Arabic versions, which were then introduced to the Western world. Renaissance literally means rebirth, and this was originally meant in a spiritual sense from renaître, be born again. In 1785, when it was first used, it was used to mean a revival of learning, and from 1872 this term came to be in general usage. The beginning of the English Renaissance is often taken to start at 1485, when the Tudor dynasty came to power in England. That's the family of the famous English king Henry VIII and his daughter, who came to be Queen Mary, and her sister Elizabeth I. The Elizabethan era, in the second half of the 1500s, is usually regarded as the height of English Renaissance. Information on Islamic civilization in Europe during the early Renaissance period differs from the previous generation. There was limited direct interaction between the two cultures, even though there was plenty of trade between Europe and the Middle East at this time. Another reason for limited knowledge about the Islamic civilization is due to the persecution of Muslims through the Spanish Inquisition. This persecution forced many Muslims to flee to the Middle East or North Africa. The Catholic Church's opposition to Islamic civilization is best demonstrated in its plea to the Council of Vienna in 1311 to ban Muslim worship in Europe.
Following the Crusades against Islam, Britain became friendlier than continental Europe with some Muslim countries. According to an article by Isla Rossa Owen, titled British Muslim Heritage, she explains that it was since the 1550s that Queen Elizabeth cemented the alliances her father had made with the Ottoman Empire. She asked the Ottoman Sultan Murad for naval assistance against the Spanish Armada. Imagine that.
What this shows is that Muslims and Westerners did make peace sometimes, that there are ways of bridging differences without undermining what one believes in. Rossa Owen explains that with the rise of English trading companies, people came to London from all over the Orient. This was the beginning of what was to become an important legacy. The first English convert to Islam mentioned by name is John Nelson. The writer, Richard Hakluyt, who died in 1616, claimed John was, allegedly, forced to convert, though he mentions in the same story other Englishmen who had converted willingly.
Rossa Owen explains that in Tudor England there was an influx of luxury goods from the Mediterranean basin. That meant that the merchants from Muslim lands came with them. So the average Londoner would have come across Muslims in the city streets at this time.
There was a second wave of interest in the study of Arabic literature, Arabic science and Islamic philosophy starting in the 1600s in England. At the Bodleian Library of Oxford University, there were hundreds of Arabic manuscripts as well as dozens of Persian and Turkish ones available during the 1600s. We also get a hint that there were English people reverting to Islam at this time. Nabil Matar is a historian who has written, amongst other things, 2 well-respected books on such a topic. The first is titled Islam in Britain 1558 CE to 1685 CE, and the second one, which was co-authored with Gerald Maclean, is called Britain and the Islamic World 1558 CE to 1713 CE. In his first book, Matar talks a little about Alexander Ross. One of Ross's most significant accomplishments was his complete translation of the Quran into English in 1649. Although he knew no Arabic, he translated a French translation of the Quran. His translation, Al-Quran, was the first in the English language. Matar expresses that 8 years earlier, a 1641 document entitled Discovery of 29 Sects refers to a sect of Mahometans being discovered here in London. This suggests that as early as then, Muslims were beginning to form tiny communities and were noticed. Rosser Owen also mentions a comment from the writer John Evelyn. John Evelyn wrote in his memoir that a renegado Englishman escorted Moroccan ambassador Mohammed bin Hadu to London in 1682.
Later, some Unitarians, another sect of Christianity in England, became interested in the Muslim faith, and Henry Stubbs, died in 1676, wrote so favourably about Islam that it is thought he too had converted to the faith.
England's interaction with Muslims in this next period was characterized by a period of consolidation of trade with the Muslim world after the restoration of the monarchy of 1660. Rosser Owen explains that with British naval domination of the world and with the British colonial enterprise, British contact with the Muslims often took the form of Britons going eastwards rather than the other way round. It was also during this period that a series of revolutions were taking place that were to shape the world we live in today. The revolutions included the French and the American. It also included the Industrial Revolution that began in England, which was the rise of machines, like factories that took over work of many men. Another famous work was Ibn Tufail's philosophical novel Hay ibn Yaqdan, which was translated into English by Simon Ockley in 1708. The English translation of Hay ibn Yaqdan, set on a desert island, may have inspired Daniel Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe, considered the first novel in English in 1719. Only small numbers of Muslims were living in England. In 1707, the first large group of Muslims to arrive in the 1700s CE were Lascars. A Lascar was a sailor or militiaman employed on European ships from the 1500s until the beginning of the 1900s.
This is the Victorian era, when Britain was the centre of what was becoming the world's largest empire and the world's only superpower of the time. The practice of Islam in the United Kingdom was legalised by the Trinitarian Act of 1812.
During this period, notable Muslim figures connected more directly with England emerge. Rosser Owen identifies the following. One is Mr. Sheikh Deen Muhammad, who was a merchant from Bengal, settled eventually in Brighton with his Irish wife, Jean Daly. Michael Herbert Fisher, who wrote a biography called The Travels of Deen Muhammad, outlines how Deen Muhammad was a traveller, surgeon, and entrepreneur who introduced the Indian curry house restaurant in Britain. He also established shampooing baths in Great Britain, where he offered therapeutic massage. He was so renowned for his therapeutic remedies that he became King George IV's shampooing surgeon. Another was Abdul Karim, Queen Victoria's Munshi. He served her during the final 15 years of her reign. He was one of the 2 Indians selected to become servants to the Queen. According to Karim's biographer, Sushila Anand, the Queen's own letters testify to the fact that her discussions with the Munshi were wide-ranging, philosophical, political, and practical. Queen Victoria, being well aware that she ruled more Muslim subjects than the Ottoman Emperor, coordinated with the Caliph Sultan Abdul Hamid II that the positions of Shaykhul Islam of the British Isles be bestowed on a Manx convert, Abdullah Quilliam Bey.
Well, they were huge. First of all, of course, to come back into Liverpool in the late 1880s and into the 1890s and begin to tell Liverpudlians about Islam was always going to be fraught with difficulty, and we know that there were a number of protests, that on a number of occasions people were physically assaulted, that there were attacks on the mosque. So there was all of that, but also, of course, there was a very heavy media campaign against what he was doing. In some ways, I think the times that he was operating in parallel, in many ways, the times that we have gone through ourselves recently with conflict between Western countries, particularly Britain, of course, at that time, and some Muslim territories. So there was a very large conflict going on in Sudan. There was conflict in Afghanistan, nothing's changed. And I think in the environment of those kind of conflicts between Britain and Muslim territories around the world, there was a lot of what I would call jingoistic media representation of Islam in the UK at that time, or Muslim countries. So a white British lawyer trying to promote Islam was always going to be seen as an oddity and maybe even dangerous. So there were certainly major problems for him. But in spite of that, he carried on and he managed to convert around about 250 families in Liverpool and around about 500 people around Britain to Islam.
The latter part of this century saw what Rosa Owen calls the conversion phenomenon. She explains that this means that whilst previous converts to Islam had tended to convert and settle in foreign climes like Headley Churchward, a Drury Lane theatre artist, in terms of the first mosque in Britain, it is recorded as having been at 2 Glenrhonda Street, Cardiff, in 1860. It is still a registered and working mosque today under the title of Al-Manar Islamic and Cultural Centre. The Shah Jahan Mosque was built in 1889 by Dr. Gottlieb Wilhelm Leitner, which was the first purpose-built mosque to be built in the UK and Northern Europe. The land for the mosque was bought with funding from the Nizam of Hyderabad, and the mosque was built with a donation from the Begum Shah Jahan of Bhopal.
So what now? Is it right to say that the purpose of being aware of history is enough? Is it enough just to know one another? There is a difference between knowledge and wisdom. The first is to know the facts and figures. The second, wisdom, tells us what to do with the knowledge. Perhaps it is best to look at the very next verse. It reads,
إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير.
This might serve as a useful motto for the purpose of our documentary project. Knowing our histories must help to make us more righteous, not less. Make us fuller with taqwa and more mindful of God, not less. I guess it serves as a reminder also to the Ummah, the British people and you, about the bigger purpose of our lives. Think about it.
Allah, there's only one God and Muhammad is his messenger. Allah, la ilaha illallah. Allah, there's only one God and Jesus was his messenger. Allah, la ilaha illallah. Allah. There's only one God and Moses was his messenger. Allah, La ilaha illallah. Allah.